Hello and welcome to Shape the System, where we find and tell the stories that help people to rethink the way the world works. We interview people from all over the world who are helping to change our systems for the better. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures, who help ambitious founders and their teams scale up for success. More about KPMG High Growth Ventures after the interview. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Lovely episode today on Shape the System. We're almost 5 years going, I think, or 4 and a bit. I can't remember what we're up to, but we've never really talked about shopping much. And part of the reason for that is I think I battle with just shopping generally and the idea that we spend money and buy things, but our reality is we all wear clothes, eat food, and want to live good lives. So I'm really stoked today to be having a conversation about the nature of shopping and the nature of selling and also selling secondhand. So we're going to be talking to Nate Spiteri from Shopfront, an Australian company that I only discovered recently, and I was really excited by not just what they're doing, but a lot of the motivations as to why they're doing it and the types of problems it might solve. So we're going to get all into their solution and what they're doing a bit later on. But firstly, Nate, just welcome to the show and tell us a little bit about how you came to be working on this Shopfront thing in the first place.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. It's nice to connect. I am a fan of the podcast as well, so it was nice to get your message. But yeah, so how we started, I've always been pretty big on like impact businesses. So graduated university, went through the banking course, thought that was going to be the kind of journey that I was going to be on, and then I moved to London just before COVID struck, and I met 2 first-time founders who were building an alternative credit score model so that they could provide credit to people who had impaired credit scores. So whether they were from underrepresented backgrounds or lived in areas where it impacted their postcodes, we built our own model of that, and I managed to scale that into, as the first hire, into a pretty successful business, which they're still running. I think about to go for Series A or something along those lines. So yeah, we ended up being B Corp by the time I left, which is exciting. And so when I came back to Melbourne, I really wanted to do something with my impact hat on. In tandem with working at Blend in the UK, I was always running streetwear brands as well. So I had a bit of experience in my own experience in e-commerce, more as a solo founder, just kind of experimenting, creating, and kind of getting out there. And so I just really wanted to do something in innovation, impact, and kind of be something in line with fashion, not necessarily having to be fashion. And so the secondhand economy and circular economy was the space that I really wanted to play in. And when I joined Antler, when I moved back, we were planning initially to build a new marketplace because we found that the eBays and the Depop's weren't doing their job because Australia is a big textile waster. And only really realized that when I moved back. And as we started validating that kind of idea and that problem space, we quickly realized that the problem doesn't really lie so much with the buyer side, it's with the seller side. And so we decided to double down on that seller proposition, and that kind of spiraled into what Shopfront is now. Sorry, that was a very long answer, but I just gave a bit of context on the...
No, that's exactly why.
Yeah.
I love context. Perfect. There's a few things in that, so I'm probably going to go down to a couple of rabbit holes. So the kind of exposure you had to just solo working around fashion and trying to sell your own stuff, or were you getting stuff and labeling it and then on selling? Like, what? Just tell me a little bit more about what you were trying to do in fashion. And then I'm also interested kind of in the part where you were talking about kind of the secondhand part of this, as opposed to, when I think of fashion, I tend to think of buying something new, but you've sort of led to secondhand. So help me understand the connective tissue between fashion and secondhand as well.
Yeah, I think so I had my own brand for 5 years. It was called 3K. Well, I actually had a couple names, but I changed. It was more of a hobby than anything. I mean, we made a bit of money, but it wasn't. I put on a couple of events. I just used it as like a creative outlet. So I was designing my own bits, getting it sent to China, getting it sent back. But I always tried to find really high quality materials from China, because even then I didn't like the idea of people wearing things once and throwing it away. So everything I designed and made, I did my absolute best to make sure that it was super durable, super high quality, not so much luxury, but wouldn't break down within kind of a couple months, right? And so I always kind of looked at things from that lens. But yeah, through that experience, obviously met a lot of secondhand sellers, a lot of influencers, and that the space, especially streetwear, is tied into like your sneakers, which ties into reselling, which ties into the resale market in general. So I'd always be kind of buying shoes, selling them, buying jackets, selling them. Like that was just part of how I rotated my wardrobe constantly. At one point, like majority of my stuff was either thrifted or I designed it myself. I wasn't really buying things outright from like a brand or a retailer. And if I was, it was a local brand as opposed to kind of a massive brand. So just like at the time, it wasn't I'm doing this to save the planet. It was just that's how I liked to. That was just my purchase behavior and my behavior as a buyer and as a seller to maintain that buying habit, right? So yeah, it's funny that all kind of was doing a good thing for the environment, but that wasn't the motivation at the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I kind of like, I'm just unpacking it as you're saying it. The thing that I sort of have, and this is why I said I've battled to tackle this topic on the show over 5 years, even though the impact is massive, right? We see these, is it in the Atacama Desert, there's this just pile of clothes that just, no one wanted the first time around, let alone the second time around. But I think the distinction here is that when someone is looking for something from a fashion perspective, often they're looking for something that's new to them, but not necessarily new, full stop. And that distinction, I think, is the bit that I'm just kind of finally gleaning from you talking through this.
Yeah. I think, spending time in the UK, like when I was growing up in Melbourne anyway, like Savers and Salvos, like that, when you have no money as like a 16 to 18-year-old, you're using that to like look like you're dressing like you have a little bit of cash, right? To kind of keep up with the trends. And there are phases where that sort of style is in fashion anyway. So it's like it's a twofold effect there. But when I was in the UK, that was definitely more prominent. Like the vintage stores there's like hundreds or if not thousands of vintage stores that I would cross by, that I've walked by, and I think it was just more engraved and a lot more simpler to participate in when I was in the UK. So I was a little bit gobsmacked when I came back to Melbourne, and to sell a few pairs of shoes or sell a jacket, it just took me so long, and it was just like no one was buying it. It was just I had to be on like several different marketplaces. Like I was feeling the pain of the customer that we're now serving, and that was the kind of switch, I guess, in like how this idea came about. And then I met my co-founder, who was ex-CTO at an energy startup, and it was just the perfect match. And he was able to find like some creative solutions about how AI could support and all this sort of thing. So yeah, not diving into Shopfront, but that's kind of how it all kind of evolved in a way. And it's funny, you pick apart these bits of your history that you don't really think make any sort of impact, but then you kind of are doing something, and you're like, hey, it probably wouldn't have happened if this hadn't happened. Or
yeah, you end up with all these different pieces of the puzzle, and you don't realize that they fit together to form a cohesive picture. Just kind of coming into this secondhand goods economy, I think you just called it secondhand economy, but in regards to things that you have, so physical goods presumably that you're going to resell, like it's a very nebulous, broad term. Like how big is this? What are we talking about in the context of what Shopfront's looking at? Are there particular sort of areas that you're specifically focused on? Let's just unpack this big word to begin with, and then we'll go into where it is now and where it's heading and what some of the problems are.
Yeah, the industry, like in terms of GMV, is like a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's projected to grow like substantially over the next 5-10 years. And that's obviously being compounded by cost of living crisis, people making more conscious decisions, trends, and fast fashion having this bad rap. So you kind of put all this in a boiling pot, and all of a sudden you've got these affordable garments, more affordable garments being kind of exploded in kind of Gen Z, millennials, and all the kind of most of the population at the moment. So, but we're not, we didn't use that as a basis of building Shopfront. We're on the selling side more than the buying side. So we really had to look into how many people are selling and how to it was more to do with like the psychological behavior change of people actually selling as opposed to buying. Because I feel like it's easier to find people who buy. It's harder to find people who sell because there's more things you need to do to sell, right? To buy, all you need to do is click a button, put in your address, and it comes to you. To sell, you need to figure out the price, write the description, take the photos, package it, and then send it, and then get your money within like 5 days or a week.
And just so, but coming back to kind of the market itself, like we've used fashion as the example, but when you think about the market for what you're doing at Shopfront and more broadly secondhand goods, fashion is simply one bucket of a multitude of buckets. Like what are the other big buckets that you're thinking about other than fashion with regards to the opportunity here?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sorry, a really, really good question. So fashion, I've just been laser focused on fashion because it's just been,
Because I love shoes.
yeah, that. And it's just the low hanging fruit. And I think one of the biggest kind of contributors to the problem that we've identified, but there's furniture resale, which is another massive one. Sporting goods is huge, and memorabilia, collectibles, which isn't really secondhand, but, passed through person to person, and quite often like trading cards is an absolutely huge market as well. And these are all kind of verticals. Like vehicles and automotive parts is another one that's, I think, one of eBay's biggest categories, if I'm not mistaken. So these are all verticals that we want to play in. I think we've really decided just to focus and hone in on fashion because there are so many, like you can break fashion down into kind of 10 or 20 different segments, like luxury goods, sneakers, women's wear, men's wear, children's wear. Like there's a ton of different categories within fashion. So we just really made it our goal not to focus too much outside that for the time being, only because you end up diluting the proposition a little bit and diluting kind of your go-to-market or however you're approaching the business. But yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason we were able to secure funding was because people did understand how many verticals there were and how big this could actually get. However, that's not something that we're looking towards in the near future just yet, only because fashion is such a big problem on its own. So we want to be able to do that right first.
Yeah, and the pictures as well, right? So,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I think about Mike Smith from Zeroco, who we've had on the show a few years ago, and his entire feed is just full of photos of him on beaches cleaning up plastic. And like, if you think about Shopfront and putting a stake in the ground, then for sure it's look at all these piles of clothes. These don't need to be here. We never needed to buy those in the first place, and there's a pile of clothes that could have been sold as well. So it's very visceral and real. I want to just come back a step on the problem, but actually think about the nature of how things get sold today. And you obviously mentioned eBay. I think anyone here, I've literally just given away about 20 things on Facebook Marketplace last week. So first-hand experience on how, the nature of these marketplaces that exist. I'm kind of curious as to why do you think there is all this fragmentation? I've only mentioned two, but you mentioned two others. There's probably dozens of different places where people can buy things or people are selling things. Why is that happening? Why is that a problem?
Yeah, so I realized that there was this trend 6 to 8 months ago where you see the eBays and even Etsy, for example, starting off very niche and then just diluting over time, whether it's over 5 years, 10 years. Depop, which was a pretty culturally relevant and niche sort of fashion platform, is also now diluting into other areas of fashion where it's losing its kind of touch with its original audience. And through that through that natural growth of a business, as you're trying to chase more like revenue streams, more verticals, you end up diluting your initial proposition. And when you dilute your initial proposition, you pave the way for new entrants to come in and play in that niche, right? And I think there's just this like never-ending cycle, and that's not saying like the eBays and the Depops aren't going to be successful, because they're going to be huge and they're going to service mass market, but there will always be people who are finding niche marketplaces to sell the things that they're selling to the audience that's looking for exactly what they're selling. Like IKEA, for example, bolting on their own marketplace, and then you've also got brands that are building their own marketplaces now because the technology is available to build back-end marketplaces onto their e-commerce systems. So I just see this kind of rise of marketplaces happening and becoming more and more apparent. And I think if we can kind of be that connector so that you can list it once and it can go out to all of those relevant marketplaces, there's something really special in that, and something that I haven't seen done before. It's kind of like, creating this ecosystem, if you will, of like where to sell and opening up new channels for people so that the things do sell fast, so that if they were just on Facebook Marketplace alone or eBay alone.
Yeah, and I want to dive into some of the mechanics and the solution. I just want to come back to something you just said. So IKEA have a marketplace for selling stuff. Presumably, is it they're selling stuff buying stuff from IKEA that's from other providers, like Bunnings Warehouse have a marketplace as well. Is it that type of context, or someone saying, "Hey, if you've got old IKEA stuff, we now have a marketplace where you can list it and resell it"? Which of those is it?
The way it's not in Australia. I think it's overseas. But the way I interpreted it was IKEA goods on the IKEA marketplace. So kind of keeping the IKEA brand within circularity. Yeah,
so a brand is basically saying if you've got an IKEA, like a Patagonia, if you have a Patagonia jacket, you can go to our marketplace and sell it to someone who wants a Patagonia jacket, so that they're buying
Yeah, there are SaaS businesses in the UK right now, and actually, I think coming up locally, where they're creating these the peer-to-peer marketplaces for brands, so that, like you said, if using Patagonia as an example, if Patagonia had its own marketplace bolted onto its e-commerce store, you could sell back your Patagonia stuff through to another customer of Patagonia and keep it in that second. And what that does is obviously recoup something for the brand and give the brand an opportunity to offer discounts or future purchase opportunities to prospective buyers and sellers, rather than giving it to like an eBay or a Depop or an Etsy, where they just get the 10 to 15% fee and that seller can then go and buy whatever they want. I think it's another way for post-purchase sort of marketing and acquisition, which I've definitely seen more and more of, especially since brands are now having to do a lot for their ESG. This is a way for them to kind of keep whatever they're selling within circularity. And you can obviously pull like metadata from the order history and do things like that if you're using the brand's backend. So it does make it a faster process. But yeah, I just find it like an interesting shift in the marketplace space, because that wouldn't have been a thing like 5 years ago.
No, and I mean it's probably an entire podcast episode in itself. So we'll park it there. But just the idea that there are brands that are now releasing their own marketplaces to enable the resale of their own product to other customers, rather than going to a, eBay or a Facebook marketplace, is just a fascinating idea generally. I want to come back to kind of the sellers in your context. Now, obviously, this is going to be fashion focused, but like, what does a seller look like? Because I think there's probably a misunderstanding here, and I guess where I'm coming from this is, my limited knowledge of fashion generally, but also fashion resale and reuse, is kind of in the Rent the Runway and the other kind of spin-offs that were kind of like that, and who might be operating that. We actually had a lady who used to work for us in my prior company, and she had like 50 dresses that she rented, and she kind of fit what I would imagine is the cliche of someone being a seller in a fashion context. What's the reality?
Yes, we use the term seller to define that's just our customer, whether you're someone like yourself who might just want to sell a few things on Facebook Marketplace, or if you're a professional seller. So we're really focused on that more professional seller at the moment, only because the tools that we provide currently are to enhance your selling experience, whether it's helping you create that listing through AI and tagging and making sure that you're not missing certain information in your listing, but also using our tool to map that to several marketplaces at once, retouching and removing the background, and kind of just getting you set up for success, I guess, as a seller, to move you from like maybe a hobbyist into a business, or just to take away the time it takes to list so you can focus on sourcing and that sort of thing. But we also consider people like you a seller, where you're just casually selling maybe once or twice a month. And we have a free tier, or we will be launching a free tier, so that you can just use it to declutter or sell a few bits and pieces. But then on the other side of the spectrum, you could have a person who's making $1 million a year, or a team making $1 million a year on eBay. They would also be a seller. So you can see our verticals go like quite, how do I say this? The verticals go vertical and horizontal, where you've got different product verticals, but you've also got different seller sort of sizes.
Personas or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, personas. And so we're really catering to a specific persona right now, which is more so a vintage fashion seller that you might see in like Camberwell or Fitzroy Market, for example, because traditionally they might have a Depop store, they'll have an eBay store, they would have tried their own e-commerce store. And we know that there's a super fractured environment there, especially when you bring in-person sales. And so we felt that there was the most pain there that we were familiar with and that we could tackle the fastest. And so we've decided to go to market to that ICP first. And we've identified thousands of them in Australia already, just through kind of the partners that we're working with and the markets themselves. So yeah, we've really niched down that sort of customer profile, but we are still speaking to the broad spectrum of sellers currently. And some of them are actually using our pilot at the moment. So yeah, we've been laser focused, but we're also not losing sight of the big picture at the same time. And this is mainly fashion as well. So you can see how that can get complex if you move it outside to other verticals.
Yeah, I mean, you typically have a focus challenge at any early stage type venture, company, non-profit, whatever it is. Yours seems doubly so, because you have to choose the type of individual and the vertical in which they operate. And I mean, in some respects, it's the other side of the coin that is the reality that these marketplaces can sell anything, and they cater to any type of person selling anything, whether someone who's doing it once or someone who makes $1 million a year doing it. Focusing in the middle of that kind of cohort, persona, whatever word you want to use, I'm trying to understand what their kind of day-to-day reality looks like? Are they, you said sourcing is a big part of what they're doing, obviously having to deal with all this stuff that you're taking away from them. Like, what is the nature of that sort of part-time or full-time seller's life look like?
Yeah, so they spend on average, so the numbers of items sold per month that would be our sweet spot for now, I would say is between 50 and between 3 and 500 as the upper limit of items sold per month, which isn't a small amount. So that could be a side hustle, or it could be a kind of full-time, depending on the price of the products that you're selling in those categories. But a lot of their time, because they're selling so much, is taken on the listing, is spent on the listing process, which we know takes around 15 to 20 minutes to create one listing on just one marketplace. With the support of what we're doing, where you can just drop in the photos, we can use our tool to generate the listing details and all the tagging and remove the background and get it ready. That could be done technically within a couple minutes, and that can be listed on multiple marketplaces. So you can see that we're cutting the listing time down by up to 90%, but that's on multiple places, not just one. So they can spend more time on sourcing, on kind of on getting into the markets, on their website and SEO and their Instagram and content. These are other bits and pieces and their paid ads. These are bits and pieces that they're constantly spending time on. And these are all sort of bits and pieces that we could also help eventually. I think they're not, once you have a cohort of sellers tend to buy from sellers as well. So there's a lot of combined learning in that community. And we're already sort of seeing that in the WhatsApp channel that we have for our pilot users. Like they're feeding off each other's kind of feedback on the product as it stands, and kind of being like, oh, that sounds like a great idea. I would definitely use that. I haven't thought about this. So you can kind of see that they're working together to help us build Shopfront into what they could use as a daily tool to really take away the pain. So yeah, that's kind of what their day-to-day looks like. And what we want to do is really just 10x their kind of outcome. So yes, we help them get the product listed, but that's not the end goal. We want them to sell the product, right? So we want to provide the analytics to allow them to understand what's selling best and when to sell. So we're really focused on the outcome as opposed to just the tool, which is to get it listed.
Yeah, the administrative tool. But where are they sourcing from? Where's everything coming from?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So a lot of them actually, so we've got a lot of friends who buy in bulk. So, a few pallets a month from Bali or Japan or overseas. You can also find like locally sourced goods. A lot of people go to like your Vinnies and Salvos as well and just spend a day out trying to find the cheapest deals that they can. So there's a few ways, but there are also now SaaS businesses that are catering to this type of seller that provide like a wholesale deal with these sellers too. So yeah, it's probably a world where you could partner with someone like that and provide that sort of service in-house and create even like a drop shipping sort of situation. Like there's plenty of ways this could go, right? There's lots of problems to solve.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you worry though that the technology, like anything, right, it depends how you apply it, can be equally applied to getting and sourcing and selling new things as opposed to getting and sourcing and selling secondhand? Like are you Switzerland in all this, or how does that sort of play out for you?
Do you mean our focus being on secondhand and how it could be used for?
Yeah, I mean, you just gave the example of Bali, right? So someone in reality could use this entire thing to accelerate and maximize selling of new stuff that's been newly made as in the fashion context, rather than things that have already been made and are being, resold. Like it could be used in either context, right?
I mean, we'd have to be integrated with like your Amazon and kind of Kogan and things like that for that to work, because we're only integrated with the secondhand marketplaces, which, you wouldn't really sell primary goods. So I think the integrations we have dictate the type of customers that we would attract, if that makes sense. Like we're not integrated with any of, I mean, you could technically sell a new product on eBay. Your brands work with eBay all the time, but it's not super common. Normally you have your own e-commerce store in that case. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there's people who could probably pick, and we're not going to say no to people if they want to try Shopfront for that use case. It's just not what we're like. If anything, it's a great learning experience for us. It might give us some learnings on a future vertical, right? But
yeah, understood. I mean, I think with all of these things, you put a stake in the ground, right? And you've done this pretty explicitly and intently around here's why we exist, and that is a self-fulfilling prophecy as to the types of people it attracts. And then ultimately, if that cohort of people, as you said, or probably community even, says these are the things we need to build because this is the problems we need to solve as secondhand good sellers, your proposition will become more and more valuable to that cohort. In some respects, my guess is that cohort is massively underserviced versus the people who can get a product and put it up on a Shopify store and use a drop shipping service. Like the whole market seems to be geared towards, in terms of systems and capability, towards helping the sellers of new products as opposed to the sellers of secondhand products.
I attribute that probably to the fact that with a primary good, you can create one listing and have that sold 1,000 times. But with a secondhand good, you need to create 1,000 listings to have the same outcome, right?
Right, interesting.
So what you need, so the level of input as a retailer or a seller is 1,000 times more to get the same outcome in that example, right? Which is why it's just I think it's easier to serve the primary market than it is the secondary market because it's so fragmented.
Yeah. That's a fascinating insight. Unless there's someone floating around with 1,000 pairs of boxes that they left on a pallet that are otherwise going to rubbish that someone's picked up. I mean, what a colleague of mine in a completely different context, it sounds similar to you in that he does reselling of, hard to find goods. And he'll often go to someone who has the last 6 of a product and say, can I grab those, resell those off? So there's clearly some new that comes into it, but I totally understand your point. I want to sort of level up a bit from kind of the specifics of an individual seller. Clearly, like if you're automating a bunch of, low value or administrative work or enabling them to go onto 7 marketplaces where previously like I've only got time to put it on these 2, then you're going to have an impact to them individually. Have you got a sense of like how this, like what impact happens at a macro level? And you can use the example of, look, we've got a pilot with 50 sellers on it at the moment, and if they all utilise it the amount that we think, here's the kilos of fashion that's not going to go to waste. Like, help me understand how it plays out macro.
Yeah, I think it's a really tough one. So we're still at like hypothesis stage right now. We're really still in that. We're still in the pilot phase where people aren't using it to its full capacity just yet. So it's very hard for us to kind of say what the potential is. I think where it could have, it's funny because the people who are using it now would probably sell it anyway. So the risk of them sending something to landfill is probably a bit lower. So for example, if you're a vintage seller, you're not going to throw it away. You're just going to try it. You're just going to hold on to it for longer and find another avenue to sell it. So you're giving probably what we're doing now is probably feeding more into the circular economy, which means people can buy more. So it's kind of just accelerating the way things are listed and things are available and things can be adopted by buyers. Where I think the interesting part happens, and which is maybe phase 2 or in the next couple months or once we're kind of off the ground, is where we start to see individuals like maybe yourself who are interested in using Shopfront to declutter or to use the free tier, where they decide to use Shopfront instead of sending it to landfill or instead of throwing it away. And that's a metric that we want to track closely. I think the actual impact probably comes more from the long end of the tail rather than the kind of subscription model that we have going with the professional sellers, because that's the kind of commercial model that we've got going to keep the business running, to get us commercially viable, feed more into the circular economy faster, create more options for people to buy. But when it comes to diverting from landfill, it comes more down to that long end of the tail and behavioral change, which is something that we want to focus on once we're kind of up and running and have the product ready. There's a lot more resistance in that market. So for someone like yourself to try a new product to sell, you're going to be a bit more picky with how you perceive the app and how you use it. If it doesn't work the first time, you're unlikely to try it again. Whereas a professional seller has kind of used similar tools before and was more likely to kind of bear with us, help us build it, get it up and running. So we're kind of waiting until the product is perfected before releasing it to mass market, if that makes sense. And once that happens, then, we could have thousands of people turning into sellers. And once you do that, you're then creating this massive impact. And I think that's kind of our North Star where we want to get to eventually.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's, the popular kind of, this is a metaphor. I never really fully understand if it's a metaphor or a simile, whatever the right English word is. But I mean, it's basically kind of the Tesla playbook, right? Where you're selling a Roadster and there's a small number of people who pay a lot of money because they're highly, enamored in the problem and they're already in the problem and they're searching for the solution. And to be honest, the economics and the hassle don't add up for anyone else. But you use that small cohort to refine and build the technology so that you can get it to an economic scale where the long tail says, this is better than what I was doing today. And if I think about that long tail, you've got kind of I think there is not a person who has a roof over their head who doesn't have stuff under that roof that they would prefer not to have under that roof in terms of stuff that they've bought and no longer want. And if you think about that as the market opportunity, it's a case of, well, at some point the technology will be known enough and accessible enough and usable enough that even someone who is literally a sample size of one in terms of the stuff they want to get rid of once will still look at this and say, this is better. I have no idea how to go to Facebook Marketplace, but I bought something secondhand from someone who sold, leveraging Shopfront. And there was some interaction that I had that made me realize that if I ever need to get rid of stuff, even only once, I'm better off going to Shopfront to do that rather than going to an individual marketplace to try to do it.
Yeah, that's the dream. And there's obviously there's a few blockers before we get to that point, because that requires a lot of, high level, like pretty intense technology to make it that rapid, that fast, that seamless. Yeah, there's a lot of UX investment to make sure you can get to that sort of that place where people are like, this is so fast, so easy, I've got it sold. Like that's the kind of dream. But yeah, we're kind of just focusing on this middle cohort at the moment. I mean, on the other side, there's also brands, right? Like there's excess stock in brands, which goes to landfill all the time. So there's this whole other world that there's both the extreme sides of the spectrum that we could go after that would have a much bigger impact than the slice that we're going after now. It's just the slice that we're going after now, as you said, using the Tesla example, makes sense because there's familiarity. It's just easier to launch with and help build that engine to kind of scale either way.
Yeah. And look, it kind of reminds me, and this sounds like an odd reference and I'm showing my age by talking about it, but when Hotmail came out, their marketing hook and hack that scaled them was basically putting sent by Hotmail on the edge of the email. And it turned someone who received an email from a webmail-based client into a user because they're like, oh, I want to send emails from anywhere as well. And I feel like part of what you're doing here really is creating a movement of people who are utilizing technology to ensure that more things that are secondhand have the opportunity to be secondhand, and actually be utilized second or third time. And I know I just read a great post literally this morning that said when you try to change markets, one of the first things you have to change is you have to change the context in which people actually get to experience an alternative. So if you try to compete with a shop, you won't win because the retail experience that they understand, they will default to what they know. But if you present them with an alternative that's in a different context, i.e. you just bought this thing off a Shopfront powered seller, if you ever have something to sell, even if it's a secondhand thing you don't realise, you've changed the context because you've introduced something at a different time. And then it's just a case of when the technology makes sense. What I think you might be surprised is how many people could actually be part-time or full-time sellers and probably don't even realise it. Do you know?
That's I know that for a fact, which is part of the reason why we know that, but even before we get to that very long end, there's even like several customers in between that sell maybe 10 a month, maybe 20 a month, but don't even realize it because they're selling and buying. And that's just like how I was. That's just their habitual nature on how they kind of wear their clothes and use them. Yeah. Like I would never have considered, at one point I would have probably considered myself a seller, but like for the most part, like for 10 or so years, it was mainly just part of my lifestyle. It was just like, constantly. And I feel like, I knew the marketplace is like the back of my hand, but it was still difficult. Like it wasn't like an easy process. I still would have loved to use something like Shopfront.
Oh, it's a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
It's a pain in the butt. Very good. Facebook would make a lot of people happier if they remove the "is it still available" button. Just that by itself would be...
Oh, to be honest, we are integrated with Facebook. Part of me wishes that we weren't because it's not like another marketplace. It's kind of just like an advertisement more than anything. Like you can't even track when something's sold. You just basically have a message that's on Facebook still. Like the best, it's just a really different sort of experience. And I don't think like professional sellers even like Facebook Marketplace because it's just, it's just there's no investment. It's like Facebook was just like, let's let people sell stuff. That's it.
Oh yeah. We're
not going to do anything other than that. Yeah.
I want to come into just some of the economics. So I'm interested, you've mentioned it a couple of times, you have an economic model. But I'm also interested in the economic model of the marketplaces themselves and the interaction between your economic model and theirs. Like, how does that all look?
Yeah, so we're very conscious, especially the first sort of community that we're serving at the moment. There's already a lot of fees that they're paying. There's a lot of kind of the margins already quite thin on secondhand fashion in a lot of cases. And so we didn't want to take an additional slice of their kind of, or additional cut of their sale. So we decided to go down a subscription route where they knew what they were paying every month. We knew what was coming in every month, just made sense. And so we based that dependent on the number of listings that you would have with Shopfront at any given month. So haven't confirmed this just yet, but the model that we're thinking of going to market with next month, or when we officially or publicly launch, is $30 a month for up to 200 or 300 listings per month, which is something that we're going to test, and that would be for your more professional sellers, and that just keeps it kind of streamlined and simple for people to interact and use the product. But because they're already paying the fees on the marketplaces, if we decided to take a clipping of the sale and they sold something on Facebook Marketplace, that means that they kind of could have sold it without a fee, but now they're paying a fee to Shopfront, and it just kind of, it gets a bit tricky from the seller's point of view. It's also quite difficult to manage where you try and take a clip of the sale. We decided just to keep it super, super lean. How the marketplaces work is traditionally a seller fee. So selling something on eBay, it's depending on the category, it could be between 10 and 15%, I think is the range. For fashion, it's around 15%. So yeah, and every marketplace works more or less the same. Depop, for example, if you sell something, it's 11 or 12%. They keep changing. I think it's recently changed. But if you boost it, so you want to get higher visibility, it's another 8% fee. So you could be charged up to 20 or north of 20% in terms of fees, which is ridiculous because the margins are so thin anyway. But an interesting point that I've noticed is that in the UK, well, in Europe, there's a new marketplace called Vinted that's kind of come along. I don't know if you've heard of Vinted. So Vinted is
this guy, Vincent? Is it called Vincent, did you say?
Vinted.
Oh, Vinted. Okay, right.
Yeah, Vinted. Vinted. But they're Lithuanian, Lithuanian, I think. Anyway, they're Europe's biggest marketplace at the moment, taking over kind of your Depop and whatnot. And the reason they got so big is because they went to market with no seller fees, but buyer fees instead. So rather than the seller having to pay anything to sell, the fee is just baked into the price that's shown to the buyer. So the buyer doesn't really know any different. The only weird thing is that when you go to buy something, it's like $13.28 rather than $12 because it's baked in this percent. But because of that, and because they've grown so massive, Depop and eBay I don't know if it's just UK, it could be UK, US, have removed the seller fees and moved towards buyer fees. So you can see how there's this shift in reducing the seller fees now to help encourage the sell into the marketplaces. I feel and I hope that would come to Australia and come to our region at some point. And if that happens, then it's much easier for us because then all these sellers or anyone selling everything has freed up some of their margin to be able to invest in products that help expedite and save time. So that's an interesting trend that I hope kind of stays and increases because, they definitely increase the need and want of a product like Shopfront.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the reason I kind of brought this up was like pricing anything, whether it's the thing you're selling or the tool you're using to help people sell, is challenging at the best of time because you're always playing to a moving market of like how does the rest of the dynamics play out, and you always have to think what's the target state of the marketplace model. If you assume there will be lots of marketplaces and you assume that ultimately they will resolve to minimal fees or fees that are essentially baked into the price of the good and no cost to list, always on success, right? So assuming they're all pretty much geared to success and there will continue to be more marketplaces coming to the market, then the problem of, disintermediation and decentralization, if you like, from a marketplace perspective is only getting worse. And so the need for something that gets you into all the places and says, like, it's not ultimately, if there was a 5% fee on eBay and a 12% fee on Depop, if it's sold on Depop, you'd still be happy to pay the 12% because it's sold, right? And you're baking that into the margin. And your job as a seller is to get the thing sold and to increase the turnover of what you're doing. And that ultimately links beautifully to the impact that you're trying to have. And so it's really only a world where the norm becomes marketplaces all charge you to list, whether it sells or not, or maybe they charge you a listing fee and a selling fee, in which case you're going to see it go the other way and you're going to have a situation where people don't want to be on multiple marketplaces because you're making it easy for them to have to pay 17 listing fees as opposed to one success fee.
Yeah, which is never going to happen, right? Because that would just cannibalize the seller community, which is and everybody knows with the marketplace, the the supply is the most difficult part to get as opposed to demand. So you would
so
always
you're
cater
already
to
at a
the
level of
supply.
maturity. Yeah, so marketplace is already a level of maturity where it looks almost like it's a disintermediated, decentralized type of economic model, which is great news for you because now what becomes important is the meta that sits around them rather than the marketplaces themselves can just argue amongst themselves for where the customers are coming from and how their economics work rather than, having to kind of be this monolithic kind of type one player. So from your perspective, like, you talk a couple of times about being super focused on fashion sellers in the 50 to 300 range. Like, what are the immediate challenges for you in taking this to market, and kind of what are the midterm challenges that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think part of the reason, I mean, this is a double-edged sword, really. Part of the reason not many people have tried to do what we do is because it's very difficult to execute. Like the back-end technology is actually quite complex. Like you use Shopfront and you're like, oh wow, I can list my product. It's so fast. Like this is easy. And you think it's like simple in the back, but it's an absolute nightmare in the back with all the APIs and everything going on in the back. Not saying we've done it badly. My co-founder is an excellent developer. It's just like it's very complex for what it looks like on the front end, which is difficult. Yeah, which is difficult to build, and it's taken us a while to build. But that adds to defensibility because it means no one can whip this up in a weekend, and because of the sheer amount of development work that's needed and the cost that's needed to actually build the product. So, yeah, one of our biggest challenges has actually been overcoming the APIs and the way in which things, because you can imagine every marketplace comes with its own challenges, its own set of attributes, its own taxonomies, and kind of just keeping them all clean and then figuring out, the best, how frequent to poll, the best way to kind of list has been a challenge. But we're at the other side now. I think our product is in really good shape. So, but yeah, for a few months, like we've had poor development experiences with teams that we've brought in to try and help us build on not just once but multiple occasions, which has kind of set us back a little bit. So yeah, we've definitely gone through the rite of passage that most startup founders go through, where you bring in someone and it backfires and you have to go, you lose 3 months.
You can outsource it and it doesn't work.
Yeah. But now we've hired a full-time dev who's fantastic. The team's growing. So we're definitely past that hump. That was just very difficult mountain to climb and get over. And then secondary, I think there's this element of, I would say, it's like to be honest, acquisition and stuff, I'm not too concerned about. Like from the customers that we've spoken to, everyone's quite excited about it. So I think once it's ready, it's going to be a pretty exciting journey to start acquiring sellers. I think it's more so coming back to the verticals and the types of customers. Like there's just a huge spectrum of who we could serve. And as a startup, it's very easy to kind of maybe get caught up in bits and pieces. So kind of just staying focused is one of the team values now, to be honest. It's like focus, collaboration, and speed is like what we kind of base most of our decisions on. So yeah, I think less the business stuff. It's more just the scaling and as the team grows, that journey into becoming like a scalable team is something that we're just learning as we go.
Yeah, I mean, it's like usually at this stage there's still lingering concerns about whether the product is going to solve the problem of the customer or whether the economic model will enable it. But I mean, there's a very specific narrow problem that you have first-hand experience in, and you're also not scratching around a very small market initially, because the problem that is experienced in Australia or Albania is fundamentally the same underlying mechanical challenge, right? So
yeah, and we also know
how
that
to access them.
In the US, there are a few competitors that do like slices of what we do and have been around for a few years and are making quite substantial revenue, like have thousands and thousands of customers. Some have even 40,000 sellers in the US only. So we already know that the market would use a product like this. We just need to build the best and most integrated and most innovative version, which is kind of what we've built from day one. It's kind of making sure we're utilizing brand new technology, making sure everything we do is in regards to speed. A lot of our competition is, they've just been around a bit longer, and I feel like have kind of maybe not come to market at a time where certain tools were available or whatnot.
Right.
And so I
feel
feel
like long in the tooth.
I mean, they're fantastic. Like it's just we've been able to identify some shortfalls and kind of make up for it in the way that we've built. Sorry, I might actually cut that bit out. I don't know if I want to.
We can cut it out. So about the 45-minute mark. No problem. I guess the more the question I was asking was like, if you think forward to the next 3 to 6 to 12 months, like what are the one or two big challenges that you're expecting? If it's just, hey, we just need to make sure the team stays focused, happy days. But I mean, maybe you don't know what you don't know. But I guess I'm curious as to, you're like, look, getting a pilot with 30 people going largely in Australia who are our friends or our network, okay, has some risk involved, but fairly manageable. To go from that to 3,000 customers or whatever your goal is, what are you worried about?
Yeah, I think it's more so, it's like scalability. So how do we tackle the next, how do we choose the next kind of cohort or the next market? So like you said, we've got a very thin slice of an ICP that we're going after, which is great. But it's like, how do we define and choose what happens after that? And what are the what are we tracking, and what are we, I feel like if we pivot to the wrong market first, that could be very detrimental to the business. So I've got a couple in mind that we know are going to work well, but it's like coming down to, do we go where there's limited competition? Do we go where there's a lot of competition, but they know the market? Like it's making these kind of early decisions. I also think we still haven't, we've got a go-to-market strategy. It's proving so far to be quite strong, but is that only going to take us so far? We're going to need to pivot in 3 months. So it's kind of like this uncertainty of, because we haven't kind of widely pushed out the product yet. It's like, is it going to be right the first time, or are we going to need to claw it back and figure out where we need to go after that? So it's like, we know that the problem we're solving for is big. We know that the product that we've got solves the problem, but it's like have we got our distribution channels locked down enough? And are we missing something? It's just like, I think every decision between now, actually every decision for the next 12 months is going to be pretty critical, because time is of the essence and we need to scale fast. So it's just, it kind of just comes back to that focus and making sure every decision is made with a clear mind, essentially, and with a clear outcome.
Yeah, wonderful. I've probably got just one more question, and it kind of relates to, it relates directly to, not kind of. I'm curious as to how much the Shopfront brand and ethos and kind of, mission is critical to the go-to-market strategy generally. Like, is it something where you're the intel and no one really knows you, but there's a kind of a logo there? Or is a big part of this is we're trying to build a mission and almost associate ourselves with this growing trend? Like, where does the Shopfront brand sit in all of this?
Yeah, we very early on decided that brand was a very critical part of what we wanted to do. Both founders coming from predominantly B2C businesses. We thought the brand, we knew and thought that brand was powerful, especially in this sort of market where we're integrated with places like Depop and eBay and all these brands that have pretty powerful kind of, brands, but you don't just use them for service or convenience. They put a lot of emphasis into the why. And we had Max, who's our creative director, join 1 month in, I think, like before we had even got the product. And he kind of helped develop our brand, our positioning, our color scheme. Like a big part of what we did early on, and one of my favorite exercises was mapping out all our competitors and figuring out that they all have a navy or a purple theme. Like literally 6 of them had the exact same color palette. So we were like, all right, lime green, done. Right. And it's kind of positioned us like outside of the ecosystem, if that makes sense, which works, because when people look at us, I don't think they look at us and be like, oh, this company's similar to XYZ. We look like our standalone business. Like the amount of times people have said, I didn't know this. I didn't even know this existed, or, oh my God, how has nobody thought of this? People have thought of it, but I just don't think maybe the brand's powerful enough that it's kind of hit the nail on the head from a discoverability and mass market point of view. So we're already kind of seeing that effect come through. But to answer your question, brand is incredibly powerful for us. We've even asked some of our pilot users why they decided to, bear with us and pay us while the product is kind of still in development. And they said, I like the team, like the brand, love what you guys are working on. Like it was less about what the product state is right now and more about like the people behind the product and the way we position ourselves. So we're already sort of on a very small scale seeing that work in our favor.
Yeah. And honestly, it wasn't a loaded question. I had a sense that you were brand savvy and brand aware and thinking about the mission and elevating that beyond simply the functional capabilities of what you're doing and who you're doing it for. But as I think if your ultimate aim here is to, to take the Tesla example to electrify the world, or I think when my notes I was like to become the Canva for secondhand sales is kind of how I'm thinking about it, then people will need to attach that idea to a brand, to something that they can physically see or talk about, or, something that they can relay to someone else. So Yeah,
100%. I think that's going to be critical for us. Like, I even think even when it's not mass market, the audience that we're dealing with, they're very sensitive to brand. Like, they're not going to. If the product, maybe if there was a competitor that was maybe 30% better, but we had a better brand and we're talking to them every day, they would still probably use us and kind of work with us. We've had some pilot users show us that they're using the competitors and tell us what they don't like or what on demo and just send it to us. And we've been able to kind of use that as part of our kind of feedback loop, which has been fantastic. And it's very hard to get that as a startup, right? You don't get many people who are already paying for another service use your service and show you the other service and what they don't like about it.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah, it was
Power brand.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's a couple people that have done that. So brand is incredibly powerful for us, and we're going to double down on it this year, I think.
That's awesome. Well, Nate, awesome chatting to you today. We always get to 50 minutes. I love it. I can't wait to see where you land in the next year or two. I think, you're at this wonderful inflection point that's happening just with the round that you just completed, obviously, and your ability now to go all in on that initial target. And then you're opening up in about a month, probably when this comes out, actually. So,
I don't want to put a time cap on it because it always ends up being delayed. But, hopefully in the next month or so, yeah.
Well, to be fair, by the time this comes out, that might also be in a month, and I don't want to hold myself to that too. So at some point before or after when you hear this interview, you will be able to get access to Shopfront more broadly.
Exactly.
But either way, it's going to be great seeing you guys out in the market and seeing what comes of it. So thanks again for joining us on the show today.
No worries. Cheers, mate. Appreciate it.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Shape the System. As usual, if you'd like to suggest a guest, someone that you know who's helped change a system for the better, please go to www.shapethesystem.org, click on the top right-hand corner, then click Suggest Guest. Make sure that you click subscribe so that you get the new episode. Shape the System is an independent podcast with support from KPMG High Growth Ventures. Connects founders to the services they need along their journey. Whether you are looking to refine your strategy, mature your finance function, prepare for a capital raise, expand abroad, or simply comply with regulatory requirements, they provide you with the support you need to drive your business forward.